Every palace, no matter how grand, harbors its own mysteries. Whispered secrets carried on drafts that slip through ancient corridors, stories etched into the very stones that have witnessed centuries of history. But Buckingham Palace, with its imposing stone walls weathered by countless seasons and its gilded halls that gleam under the weight of golden chandeliers, guards its secrets with an almost impenetrable silence. To the outside world, it is much more than just a residence. It is a living symbol of an unbroken monarchy, an enduring bastion of tradition and ceremony, a place where the grandeur of history and the pomp of royal life meet in perfect harmony. Visitors see only the surface, the polished marble floors, the rows of portraits depicting regal ancestors, the fluttering Union Jack above the palace gates, but beneath this sparkling façade lies a far darker truth. A truth shaped by the frailties of the human heart, by the quiet machinations of political intrigue, and by the crushing weight of expectations placed on those who wear the crown. For Thomas, Buckingham Palace was not merely a workplace. It was the stage on which his life's dedication played out. For 15 long years, he had stood as one of the palace guards, a silent sentinel in a sea of red tunics and bearskin hats, embodying the image of regal stability that countless tourists and dignitaries alike had come to expect. His uniform was always immaculate, his posture rigid and unyielding, the practiced impassiveness of his face hiding the man beneath. The palace walls had been his constant companions, and every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by flickering candlelight, was as familiar to him as his own reflection. Yet behind the stoic mask of the bearskin and the ceremonial precision of his movements, Thomas was a man who had quietly observed more than any of his superiors could have imagined. A man who had seen the delicate balance of power and vulnerability that held the monarchy together. That winter, cold, unforgiving, and laden with a palpable sense of foreboding, would become the defining moment of Thomas's years of service. It was in those months, amidst the biting chill and the muted bustle of palace life, that he glimpsed a tragedy unfolding in agonizing slow motion. It was a tragedy carefully concealed from the eyes of the world, hidden behind layers of protocol and secrecy, yet searingly real to those who bore witness. What Thomas saw that winter would haunt him forever, forever altering his understanding of loyalty, courage, and the true cost of the crown. The cold that December had seeped far beyond the surface of London's streets, it had settled deep into the very bones of the city, wrapping everything in a relentless grip of frost and chill. The palace grounds lay beneath a delicate, crystalline blanket of frost that shimmered faintly in the early morning light, fragile as lace and yet unyielding in its reach. The sharp, biting air seemed to claw at any exposed skin, turning cheeks red and fingers numb despite the thick gloves and woolen scarves worn by the staff. Even the mighty oaks and elms lining the palace grounds stood silent and stoic, their branches weighed down with icy crystal, like ancient sentinels bearing witness to a looming storm. Thomas stood rigid at his post near one of Buckingham Palace's lesser-known entrances, an old, heavy door of dark oak that was rarely opened except to allow passage to trusted courtiers, essential staff, and occasionally medical personnel. This entrance was tucked away from the grand public eye, a quiet artery into the sprawling heart of the palace. Normally, this corner of the palace buzzed with the soft rhythm of footsteps and muffled conversations, but today, an unnatural stillness hung heavy in the air, a silence that seemed to swallow sound whole. It was broken only by the hurried, sharp footsteps of medics moving back and forth with tense urgency, their faces grim and focused, their movements purposeful but frantic, like a storm racing toward a breaking point. From his vantage point, Thomas's eyes caught a figure moving slowly along the corridor beyond the heavy door. It was King Charles. But the man before him was barely recognizable. The king, who had once commanded rooms with effortless authority and whose presence had captivated audiences from Buckingham Palace to distant Commonwealth nations, was now a shadow of that formidable figure. His usual composure was shattered, replaced by something fragile and spectral, as if the life force that had once radiated from him had been slowly drained away. His skin was unnaturally pale, nearly translucent, as if the warmth of blood had fled from his veins. His posture was slumped, the regal bearing that had once held the weight of centuries of monarchy now crumpled under an invisible burden. It was as though the very crown he had worn for so many years had become a crushing weight, a shackle that bent him low. His eyes, once sharp, fierce, and full of unwavering determination, now looked glazed and unfocused, reflecting a deep and haunting mix of pain, fear, and bewilderment. They were the eyes of a man caught in a terrible storm, lost in a sea of suffering and uncertainty. Thomas felt the air around the king thicken, almost as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath in dread. The normally steady rhythm of palace life had fractured, replaced by a tension so tangible it seemed to cling to the skin like the biting cold outside. Thomas's own heart pounded wildly against his chest, an overwhelming flood of fear and helplessness surging through him. Guards were trained to be the embodiment of stoicism, to conceal emotion beneath layers of discipline and ceremony. But in that moment, Thomas felt a crack in the unshakable façade of royal infallibility, a glimpse behind the curtain of power to see a man stripped bare, vulnerable in his suffering. In the days that followed, Buckingham Palace transformed from a place of elegant ceremony into a hive of secrecy and quiet desperation. The corridors that had once echoed with a measured cadence of palace life, the soft footfalls of courtiers, the distant strains of orchestral music, the polite laughter during receptions, now lay subdued, filled instead with hushed whispers and hurried glances exchanged behind tightly drawn curtains. The usual pomp and pageantry of the monarchy, from glittering balls to carefully staged public appearances, ceased abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence that unsettled even the most seasoned staff who had served the palace for decades. Thomas observed the constant comings and goings of medical personnel, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Each day, the king's condition seemed to worsen, his once robust frame growing weaker, his breath more labored, his movements slower and more hesitant. His body was being ravaged by an unseen enemy, an invisible force that gnawed relentlessly at his strength and will. Yet, behind layers of palace secrecy, protocol, and an unyielding desire to protect the crown, the true cause of the king's deterioration remained a tightly guarded secret. Among the staff, rumors drifted like restless ghosts, whispered cautiously in corners and behind closed doors. Some spoke in muted tones of a stroke, a sudden and devastating blow that had struck the king's health. Others hinted at something far darker, poisoning, sabotage, or even a medical conspiracy. Yet no one dared speak these words aloud, not for fear of the consequences, and not out of loyalty to the throne. The palace's silence was a shield, but also a prison, locking away truths that could shatter the fragile peace. Thomas, however, soon discovered that the truth was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. A truth that would shake the foundations of the monarchy and change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, power, and the human cost of a crown. The betrayal that unfolded within the walls of Buckingham Palace was unlike anything Thomas, or anyone, could have anticipated. It was not the work of distant political adversaries lurking beyond the kingdom's borders, nor was it the consequence of public dissent or scandal. This was a betrayal born deep within the king's own inner circle, a wound inflicted not by strangers but by those who had long been trusted implicitly. These were the people who had stood beside King Charles through countless moments of triumph and trial, the faces that had appeared loyal and steadfast in the corridors of power. Yet beneath that veneer of fidelity lurked a chilling duplicity, a cold, calculated treachery that struck at the very heart of the monarchy. The acts of betrayal were insidious and cruel, perpetrated in the quiet shadows where few eyes could see. Medications were tampered with, carefully manipulated to weaken the king rather than heal him. Treatments were interfered with, crucial care delayed or denied under the guise of duty. These were not mistakes or accidents but deliberate, ruthless actions carried out with chilling precision. The facade of loyalty was a mask, hiding ambition that brooked no restraint, ambition that regarded the sanctity of life as a mere obstacle to be discarded. The palace, a place of tradition and reverence, had become a stage for a grim power play where human life was secondary to the thirst for control. Thomas noticed the change ripple through the ranks of the palace guards. Once a brotherhood forged by discipline and mutual respect, the group now moved with a tension that was almost palpable. Eyes that had once held unshakable trust began to flicker with suspicion. The simple camaraderie of shared duty gave way to fractured alliances and guarded conversations. Paranoia seeped into every corner of the palace, turning colleagues into strangers and every whispered word into a potential threat. The bonds that had once seemed unbreakable now frayed under the weight of fear and uncertainty. As the king's body grew weaker, so too did the walls around him. His isolation deepened profoundly. Once a figure of unyielding strength and unwavering certainty, King Charles became a man diminished, vulnerable in a way few had ever witnessed. Dependent on others for the most basic care, trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed, he seemed to shrink beneath the crushing weight of his crown. That symbol of duty and honor, which once inspired loyalty and admiration, now served only as a reminder of his fading power and the life slipping slowly through his grasp. The crown, once a beacon of regal majesty, had become a heavy burden, a cruel emblem of sacrifice that offered no comfort but only underscored his fragility. Throughout these dark days, Thomas's own loyalty was put to the ultimate test. The instinct to protect the monarchy warred violently with the growing horror that gripped him in the palace's oppressive silence. He was no longer just a guard, a silent observer stationed at the gates. He was a witness to a tragedy unfolding in the shadows, a tragedy that threatened to unravel the very foundation of the royal institution. The palace's quiet complicity weighed on him like a leaden chain, and he wrestled with his conscience, torn between duty and the desperate need for truth. When Thomas finally resolved to come forward, it was not a decision made lightly or without fear. The risks were monumental. He faced the possibility of losing his position, the respect of his peers, and even his personal freedom. Yet the unbearable weight of silence, of knowing and not speaking, had become too great to bear. His testimonial would peel back the polished curtain on Buckingham Palace's darkest hour, exposing not only the king's physical decline but the festering depths of betrayal within the royal household. The public reaction to Thomas's revelations was explosive and immediate. The carefully cultivated image of King Charles as an indomitable figure of strength and stability shattered overnight, replaced by a raw, painfully human portrait of vulnerability and treachery. The nation, gripped by shock and sorrow, was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: that even the most revered and time-honored institutions were not immune to the corrosive forces of corruption and decay. Sympathy for the king swelled, mingled with a powerful demand for accountability, transparency, and sweeping reform. The shock waves reverberated through Buckingham Palace, shaking it to its core. Investigations unearthed a web of deceit and manipulation far more extensive than anyone had imagined, leading to dramatic arrests and a thorough purge of those implicated in the conspiracy. Medical protocols were overhauled to ensure the king's safety and well-being, security tightened to prevent further breaches, and the once impenetrable palace walls seemed to breathe a little easier, cleansed of some of the darkness that had taken hold. King Charles's slow and agonizing recovery soon became a powerful symbol of resilience and hope. With the steadfast support of loyal aides and a newly galvanized staff committed to transparency and care, the king began to reclaim his strength, his spirit rekindling gradually amid the shadows of betrayal. The nation watched, riveted, as the man behind the crown faced his greatest battle, not against external enemies or political foes, but against the insidious shadows that had taken root within the palace itself. For Thomas, life was forever changed. The quiet guard who had stood silently at his post for years had become an unlikely hero, the keeper of secrets who dared to speak the truth, breaking the silence for the good of the monarchy and the country. Though he remained humble, avoiding the spotlight, his courageous act left an indelible mark on the royal institution, reshaping its future and reminding all of the fragile humanity at the heart of power. The story of that winter, the silent suffering of a king, the bitter betrayal from within, and the courage of a single guard, became legend. It was a stark reminder that behind the dazzling pageantry of royalty lay fragile human beings, wrestling with pain, fear, and the desperate hope for redemption and renewal. In the end, Buckingham Palace was no longer merely a symbol of monarchy. It became a mirror reflecting the complexity of power, the fragility of loyalty, and the enduring strength found in truth. Like and subscribe the channel for more interesting stories of the royal palace.